Not every act of kindness needs a spotlight. This is the story of a woman who walked into a diner with nothing, not even a seat, and of the man who noticed her when no one else did. A child, a simple meal, and a mother's silent strength would awaken something long buried in a man who thought he had everything. What began with a single kid's meal would unravel into a quiet transformation, not just of lives, but of purpose. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching this story from? Drop your country in the comments. We'd love to know. Now, let's begin. Some streets carry stories no one notices. They breathe quietly between passing cars, behind smudged windows, and beneath the hum of everyday routines. There was nothing extraordinary about the corner of 3rd and Elmore, a modest strip of city, where laundromats, diners, and discount stores stretched shoulder to shoulder, each hiding their own private dramas behind fluorescent lights. But on this particular morning, just after sunrise, something small and quiet unfolded inside a small neighborhood diner. Nothing that would make the news, nothing anyone would stop to film, but it would change the course of one man's life forever. The diner wasn't fancy. It didn't try to be. Its red leather booths were worn smooth from years of elbows, baby seats, and newspaper creases. The coffee was always fresh, the eggs a little too greasy, and the regulars came in early, always before the morning rush turned their comfort into chaos. The bell above the door chimed with every entrance like a sleepy heartbeat. Familiar, predictable, and that was exactly why a man like Everett Callahan chose to spend his mornings there. To anyone watching, Everett was just another well-groomed professional on his way to work. He wore a navy coat, pressed slacks, and an expensive scarf that never seemed out of place, yet somehow never quite belonged. He always chose the same booth, the one tucked beside the window with the crooked blind, and sat facing the room, sipping tea without sugar, reading the same newspaper he'd already skimmed online. What no one knew, not the servers, not the cooks, not even the regulars who greeted him with casual nods, was that Everett didn't just eat there. He owned the place. He had bought the diner 2 years earlier, anonymously, under a shell company. Not out of sentimentality, not even out of investment strategy. Simply because, after decades of building wealth that climbed over skylines and spilled into countries he never visited, he realized there was a kind of peace in places untouched by ambition. The diner wasn't scalable, it wasn't profitable, but it was real, and that felt like something worth keeping. Every morning, Everett blended into his own property like wallpaper. He watched, he listened, not out of control or ego, but because it reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. The way people sat with their coffee in silence. The way a mother wiped syrup from her son's face with a napkin corner. The way life, stripped of all gloss, still carried warmth. And that morning, warmth is what she was looking for. She stepped in quietly, holding the hand of a small boy with golden curls flattened by the cold. Her coat was thin, her jeans soaked, halfway up from the wet pavement. Her eyes scanned the room not for a menu, but for a place. Just a place. The diner was unusually crowded, something Everett noticed immediately. A delivery truck delay had pushed the early rush later than usual, and most of the booths were still full. The woman approached the counter, hesitating before she spoke to the hostess. No one else seemed to notice her, no one except Everett. She said something too softly to hear. The hostess nodded. A few seconds later, she handed over a kid's menu and a plastic cup of water. The woman took it gently and turned, scanning for a seat. There were none. Every booth, every stool, every table held someone, reading, eating, scrolling, talking. The noise swirled gently around her, but she stood still. Then, with quiet resignation, she walked to the far wall, knelt down, and sat cross-legged on the tile floor with the boy in her lap. She unzipped his jacket, handed him the cup, and used the kid's menu like a plate as they waited. No complaint, no visible shame, just silent intention. Everett lowered his paper. He'd seen people eat alone before, Seen people come in soaked from rain, late for shifts, stressed from arguments. But something about her, the way she wrapped herself around the boy like a human barrier, the way she smiled at him as if the tile floor was a throne, unsettled something in him. He tried to return to his tea, but the steam felt distant. The clatter of forks seemed suddenly loud. Something inside Everett shifted. Not just curiosity, not pity. Something deeper, harder to name. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. He set down his cup. Some moments don't come with thunder. They arrive like soft taps on glass, easy to ignore unless you're listening. Everett had spent his whole life tuning out the quiet, but today, for reasons he couldn't explain, he listened. That morning, a millionaire sat unnoticed in his own diner, watching a young woman feed her child on the floor, and the world he thought he knew, of numbers, meetings, investments, and polite conversations, began to fracture. Not loudly, not yet, but enough to let something else in. It wasn't the first time Everett had seen someone quietly fall through the cracks, but something about her lingered. Maybe it was the way she never looked up, not once, as if looking would invite shame or worse, attention. Maybe it was the way her arms wrapped around the boy, not just to hold him close, but to shield him from something the rest of the world couldn't see. Everett remained seated, his body still, but his thoughts moving faster than he wanted. He watched as the boy sipped water slowly, cupping the plastic like it was precious. The child looked no older than 5. Blonde curls, flushed cheeks, and eyes that darted between his mother's face and the front counter, hopeful but trained in disappointment. 10 minutes passed, no plate arrived. The woman didn't complain. She didn't tap impatiently or glance at the kitchen. She just waited, quietly, patiently, like someone who knew that asking for more usually brought less. Eventually, the hostess reappeared with a small plastic tray. A grilled cheese sandwich, sliced diagonally, with a handful of fries and a paper napkin. She knelt to offer it with a polite smile, then returned to the counter without another word. The woman whispered something to the boy. His face lit up as he reached for the sandwich with both hands, taking slow bites as if trying to make it last. She didn't touch the food. Everett noticed that immediately. She wasn't hungry, or rather, she didn't allow herself to be. Everything about her posture told him this meal was not for her. She didn't look tired in the typical sense. She looked like someone who had mastered the art of invisibility, someone who had practiced making herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. She leaned into the wall not for comfort, but to stay out of the way. And as the boy chewed with focus, she smiled. Not widely, not theatrically. Just a small, private curve of her lips, the kind only mothers wear when watching their child find comfort in the smallest of things. Everett felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't a random moment. This was a ritual. He flagged down one of the newer servers, a college kid named Ron who was still learning the rhythm of the place, and asked about the woman. Ron squinted toward the wall, trying not to stare. "She's been in a few times," he said, lowering his voice. "Always orders the same thing. Kid's meal, just one, never sits. If it's busy, she waits. If it's not, she still picks the booth near the kitchen, the one nobody really likes." Everett nodded slowly, listening but already thinking ahead. "What's her name?" "No idea," Ron said. "Never gave one. Paid in cash. Doesn't stay long." Of course she didn't. People like her knew how to move through the world without leaving footprints. That was how they survived. Everett's gaze returned to the boy, who was now licking a smear of cheese from his finger. The woman tore a napkin in half, gently cleaning his hands before wrapping the rest of the sandwich in the paper and placing it inside her coat pocket. Probably saving it for later, probably for him. She stood carefully, guiding the boy up by the hand. There was no rush in her movements, only intention, practiced, rhythmic, and humble. She returned the plastic cup to the counter, smiled faintly, then walked toward the door. Everett stood too. He told himself it was coincidence, that he happened to be done with his tea, that he had a call to take. But none of that was true. He moved because something in him had already decided. This was no longer a morning like the others. Outside, the cold air clung to the buildings, turning exhaled breath into ghostly clouds. The woman held the boy close, crossing the street without an umbrella or gloves. Her coat, too thin for winter, billowed slightly with each gust. She stopped at the corner, looked both ways and turned right. Everett followed from a distance. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't the kind of man who followed strangers through busy streets. But this didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like gravity. The woman and child walked for 3 blocks before turning into a narrow alley behind a drugstore. She knelt again, pulling something from behind a stack of broken crates, a worn wool blanket. Then she sat down beside the boy, wrapping them both in the same motion she had used on the diner floor. No words, just warmth. Everett stood on the corner, pretending to check his phone, eyes fixed on the scene like a man watching a silent film through a dirty lens. He had always believed in systems, structure, balance sheets, policies, foundations. He gave to causes, donated regularly, attended galas. But this wasn't a cause. This was a mother. This was love. And love, in its truest form, didn't need permission or applause. It didn't come with forms or tax receipts. It looked like a woman offering the last piece of bread to a boy too young to understand sacrifice, but old enough to feel safe when her arms wrapped around him. Everett stayed there longer than he meant to. Eventually, a passing truck broke the moment. The woman shifted, tucking the boy's head beneath her chin, whispering something only he could hear. His eyes closed. Her body stilled, and Everett turned away. Not because he was done watching, but because watching wasn't enough. Something had begun, quietly, internally. And though he didn't yet know what it meant, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, if she returned to the diner, things would be different. Not because she asked, but because someone finally saw her and refused to look away. The next morning, Everett arrived at the diner earlier than usual. He didn't read the paper, didn't sip his tea. He simply waited. There was something different in the way he sat now. Not the composed stillness of a man passing time, but the quiet tension of someone expecting something to arrive, though not sure what he would do once it did. At 8:17 a.m., the door chimed. She entered just as before. Same coat, same pace, same downward gaze. The boy clung to her hand like a familiar lifeline, his curls slightly damp from the morning mist. They walked straight to the counter, where the same hostess greeted her with that polite, distracted efficiency reserved for regulars who never caused trouble. "Kid's meal, please," the woman said softly, almost rehearsed. Everett couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the rhythm. Short, polite, unassuming. She paid in cash again. Exact change. The hostess glanced around. Most of the booths were still taken. But this time, something was different. Ron, the new server, walked up beside the woman, holding a tray with a juice box and a folded kids menu. "You can sit right over here," he said, gesturing toward a booth near the back that Everett had quietly instructed him to keep open, no matter how busy it got. She hesitated. For a brief second, she glanced toward the boy, then back at the booth, a place to sit, a real table. It was a luxury she clearly hadn't expected. Her eyes didn't sparkle. She wasn't someone who indulged in gratitude that easily. But she gave a small nod. They sat. The boy slid into the seat first, legs swinging beneath the table. She followed slowly, her hands resting flat on the table as if making sure it wouldn't vanish. Everett watched from his usual corner, not as a man overseeing a business, but as someone carefully observing the unfolding of something sacred. He kept his distance, said nothing. But his eyes missed nothing. She asked for nothing more, just the usual meal. But for the first time, she waited for it at a table, with both hands visible, her back straight, her son beside her, not in her lap. The gesture felt monumental, though small to anyone else. Everett asked Ron to bring her a hot tea. "On the house," he said. "She didn't order tea," Ron replied, confused. "She doesn't need to," Everett said simply. "Just bring it over. Say it's a mistake if you have to." A few minutes later, Ron approached her table with the drink. "I think this was meant for another table, but since it's here, you can have it if you like." She stared at the cup for a long moment. Then, finally, she wrapped her hands around it, letting the steam rise between her fingers. She didn't drink it. She just held it, as if it had been years since something warm had been offered to her, not just the child. It was then that Everett realized something. Everything she did was for him. Every choice, every compromise, every silent moment, all of it was designed to protect the boy. The food, the warmth, the quiet strength in her posture, none of it was for herself. She hadn't just ordered a kid's meal. She had ordered dignity for him, even if it meant erasing herself. After they finished eating, she packed the remaining fries into a napkin, placed them carefully into her coat, and rose to leave. She cleaned the table with the gentleness of someone who knew the value of leaving things better than they were found. Everett rose too, but not to follow. Not yet. Instead, he asked Ron a question that had been echoing since yesterday. "Where does she go after this?" Ron shrugged. "No idea. She doesn't stay long. Walks east, I think." That was enough. Everett didn't need an address. He needed understanding. So he waited 5 minutes, left cash on the table, and followed. Not as a man chasing answers, but as someone searching for meaning in footsteps that had gone ignored too long. She turned east again, as Ron had said. Same alley, same crates, same blanket, folded behind the bins. She set it down, pulled the boy close, and sat beneath a concrete overhang that barely shielded them from the drizzle. No anger, no tears, just repetition. Routine. Survival. Everett didn't get close this time. He simply stood across the street beneath an awning and watched. In his mind, numbers started forming. Calculations, possibilities, names of shelters, programs, places he'd written checks to but never visited. He'd always seen poverty from a polite distance, a cause to support, not a reality to confront. But this woman didn't fit into any line item. She was more than circumstance. She was a force, quiet and unyielding. He stayed longer this time. Long enough to see the boy fall asleep again in her lap. Long enough to see her sip the tea he'd sent. Cold now, but still sipped, as if honoring the gesture more than the drink. When he turned to leave, something had changed. He no longer saw her as just a struggling mother. He saw her as a mirror of resilience, of unconditional love, of all the things money could never buy and success could never teach. And he knew then, truly knew, that feeding her son was never the goal. What she had been doing every day was holding back a world that threatened to swallow him, alone, until now. The following week, Everett kept his routine. Same table, same coat, same cup of tea he no longer finished. But something inside him was different now. He didn't come to the diner to pass time or feel grounded. He came for her, or rather, for the quiet truth she carried without knowing it. Each morning, like clockwork, she returned. Always with the boy, always with the same gentle resignation in her posture. She never expected more, never asked for help. And in that silence, Everett found himself more drawn than he could explain. It wasn't just about kindness anymore. It was something deeper, almost painful. He couldn't stop wondering. How long had she been doing this? And why hadn't anyone noticed before? He needed answers. Not from her. She wasn't someone who would respond well to questioning. She wore her boundaries like armor. But maybe the city could tell him what she wouldn't. So Everett made some calls, not to his usual network. Not lawyers or accountants or assistants. This time, he reached out quietly to a community center not far from the alley he'd seen her in. A shelter worker named Grace agreed to meet him. They spoke over lukewarm coffee in a converted church basement. Grace listened more than she spoke. When Everett described the woman, her coat, the boy, her routine, Grace nodded slowly. "I think I know who you're talking about," she said. "Name's Rachel. She doesn't come here often, doesn't like being seen." "She's homeless?" Everett asked, already knowing the answer. Grace sighed. "Not officially. She doesn't register for programs. No ID, no case file. She shows up for blankets, sometimes food, always for the boy. She won't sleep indoors if she can't keep him beside her." Everett absorbed the words. "She avoids shelters?" he asked. "She avoids anything that smells like failure," Grace said. "My guess, she had a place once, maybe a job, maybe a plan. But life cut through it. Happens more than people realize. And when that happens, pride becomes the last thing people cling to." That stayed with him. Pride, not stubbornness, not foolishness. Pride as protection, as the only thing she had left to call her own. Everett thanked Grace and left with something heavy in his chest. That night, he couldn't sleep. The apartment, clean, polished and silent, felt like a museum of things that no longer mattered. His bed, too large. His fridge, too full. His closet, a shrine to a life of meetings and appearances. But none of it made him feel alive anymore. He kept seeing her on that diner floor, the boy's small hands around the sandwich, her smile, worn and quiet, and something deeper than discomfort stirred inside him. Shame. Not because he had money, but because he had spent so long believing it was enough to give it from a distance. But she needed more than a donation. She needed to be seen. The next morning, Everett arrived even earlier. The booth he'd asked Ron to keep free was waiting. A hot tea sat ready, and when she arrived, 5 minutes after opening, there was no crowd to hide her. She paused at the doorway. He could tell she sensed something had changed. Maybe it was the way the hostess smiled a little more warmly. Maybe it was the way the boy rushed toward their table, as if it were already theirs. She sat, not nervously this time, but carefully, and Everett watched from the corner, hands folded, heart unsettled. She ordered the same meal, but when Ron returned, there was more on the tray. A small side of fruit, a muffin wrapped in parchment, and a note Everett had written himself, tucked beneath the napkin. It read only 4 words. For you, not him. He didn't expect her to read it at the table, but she did. Her eyes lingered on the words. No reaction, no visible shift. She folded the note, tucked it into her pocket, and returned to feeding the boy. But Everett knew something had cracked. Not a wall. A silence. She finished eating and rose to leave, same as always. But this time, before exiting, she looked toward his table. Not at him, not directly, but in his direction. A glance, that was all. But it was the first acknowledgement she had ever given, and Everett felt it like a door unlocking. Later that day, he walked the city aimlessly. Not to kill time, but to remember what it felt like to be part of something uncurated. He watched buskers play for strangers who never applauded. He saw a girl tie her scarf around a dog's shivering neck. He saw a man give up his spot in line for a stranger without a word. Everywhere, quiet humanity pulsed beneath the surface. And yet people like Rachel and her son moved through it like shadows. That evening, he returned to the alley. They weren't there. A part of him panicked. But then he saw them, not far away, sitting on the steps of an abandoned storefront, sharing the fruit from the diner. She was eating. Not pretending. Eating. He stood far enough not to be seen, but close enough to feel the weight of the moment, and in that instant, he saw not just a mother surviving. He saw a woman beginning to accept care, maybe not trust, not yet, but something softer, something that said, "I see you seeing me." It wasn't a rescue story. It was a reckoning. And Everett realized that no one had ever truly told him what wealth was for. Not until now. Some gestures speak loudest in silence. Everett had spent his life believing in big moves, acquisitions, partnerships, public gestures. But now, sitting alone in a quiet diner each morning, he had learned the quiet power of small, precise decisions. He didn't want to help Rachel with noise. He wanted to give her a space where help didn't feel like pity. The next day, before dawn, Everett arrived at the diner with a small notebook and a pen. He wasn't here as the invisible owner anymore. He was here as a man with intent. He spent the next hour walking through every corner of the space. What would it feel like for someone like her to truly belong here? To not just be served, but welcomed. He made changes, subtle ones. He instructed Ron and the hostess to always keep a table near the window, clean and ready. Not just available, but prepared. A folded blanket beneath the booth, tucked neatly but accessible. A second chair, even if she never brought anyone else. A cup of tea delivered without asking, always fresh. Then, behind the counter, he added a private note taped above the kitchen sink. It read, "Table 6. Never forget who it's for." It wasn't a policy. It was a promise. He didn't stop there. He went further, to the back office of the diner, to an old storage closet once filled with forgotten decorations and dusty coffee urns. With the help of a contractor he trusted, he transformed it. New paint, shelves, a small heater, a cushioned bench. Not big enough to live in, but warm enough to rest. He stocked it with clean socks, wipes, granola bars, juice boxes, and a handwritten card. "Use this when the world forgets you. Here you are remembered." It wasn't charity. It was respect for someone who had endured far more than anyone had offered her. By the end of the week, the space was ready. He never told Rachel, never handed her keys or made a speech. He simply left the door unlocked, light, unwaiting. And then he waited. That Friday morning, Rachel came in like always, except this time she paused just slightly when she stepped through the door. Her eyes flicked toward table 6, already set. Her son climbed into the booth before she even reached it. The moment she sat down, Ron placed the tea beside her without a word, and for the first time, she smiled. Not the careful, performative smile she wore for her son. A real one. Small, but real. Everett stayed in the background, invisible, but present. As the boy ate, Rachel leaned back against the booth, not stiffly, not guarded, but with something resembling comfort. She looked out the window, hands wrapped around the cup, eyes still alert, but softer now. After the meal, Ron approached with a sealed paper bag. Rachel hesitated. "I didn't order this." "It's just leftovers we'd otherwise toss," he said casually, using Everett's exact script. "Thought you might want it." She didn't question further. She took the bag and nodded. Another smile. Slight, but visible. She left as always, hand in hand with the boy. But this time, Everett didn't follow. He walked to the back hallway, where the storage closet turned sanctuary waited. The light was off, but the blanket was unfolded. A small juice box wrapper lay in the trash. She had found it. She had used it, and no one needed to know. That was the point. The next week, Everett noticed something else. She started arriving a little later. Not rushed, not panicked. She wore the same coat, but her posture had changed, upright, measured, like someone who had a little more room to breathe. She no longer waited at the counter. She walked straight to the booth, helped her son in, and sat with ease. Everett began, leaving other things in the back room, coloring books, thermal gloves, a new toothbrush still in its plastic, always unmarked, always anonymous. Nothing she had to accept with thanks, nothing she had to owe, and each time they disappeared, he started noticing things he hadn't before, the way her hands trembled less. The way the boy laughed now while eating, instead of just chewing quietly. The way she looked at the walls, the menu, the windows, like someone seeing not just survival, but possibility. Rachel never spoke to him directly, not once. But every gesture, every glance, every quiet acceptance was a conversation in itself. And for Everett, it was enough. He no longer measured his life in dividends or shares. He measured it in glances like hers, in the warmth of a child's handprint left on the window, in the peace that came from knowing that someone, even just one person, had a little more dignity than yesterday. That winter, more changes came. Everett partnered with the shelter discreetly, funded a new wing in honor of an unnamed mother. He expanded the diner's hours, added a family menu, set up a coat exchange near the entrance. Each idea rooted in her, the woman who asked for nothing, but gave everything. It was no longer about her story. It was about what her story awakened in him. And in that transformation, Everett found something he'd never chased before. Meaning, without recognition. He didn't need her to know. He only needed her to feel it. Time didn't stop at the diner. Customers came and went, seasons shifted, and the world outside carried on with its endless, indifferent rhythm. But inside that modest corner booth, something had changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but undeniably. Rachel kept returning. She still wore the same coat, but now with a scarf, one Everett had quietly placed in the back room weeks earlier, tucked between juice boxes and mittens. She never acknowledged where it came from. She didn't have to. The fact that she wore it was enough. Her son, Eli, Everett learned from a staff conversation she didn't know he overheard, began talking more during meals. He asked for ketchup. He spilled juice. He laughed. Not the cautious, apologetic laughter of a child used to restriction, but full, joyful, messy sounds. The kind of laughter that claimed space. Rachel let him. That alone was a transformation. Everett never sat with them. He never crossed that line. But from a respectful distance, he watched, always at the same time, always in silence. And as the days turned into weeks, a quiet ritual formed between them. Not of words, but of presence. Sometimes, she looked toward his table on her way out, just a glance. Sometimes not, but the connection was there. Invisible, yes, but real. And sometimes that's all the heart needs. To know someone is watching without judgment, caring without condition. One snowy morning, Everett arrived before sunrise. He unlocked the diner himself, swept snow from the entryway, and brewed the tea. It was Christmas Eve. The staff had the day off. He insisted. He wanted this one morning to be his alone to give. By 7:40 a.m. she arrived. She paused in the doorway. The lights were on. The table set. A small plate with holiday pancakes shaped like stars and trees waited, dusted with powdered sugar. A gift bag rested on the seat. Inside, a book for Eli, a warm pair of boots, and a simple handwritten card. To the strongest person I know. Rachel stepped inside. Her eyes scanned the room. It was empty, silent. Then she saw Everett. He stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tea already poured. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just nodded. Rachel nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She sat at the booth. Eli ran to the table, wide-eyed. He squealed at the pancakes. Rachel opened the bag slowly, touched the boots, and held the card for a long time without reading it. Then she placed it carefully in her coat. Pocket Everett moved to the kitchen. He cooked quietly, flipped pancakes, and refilled cups. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hover. He just made sure everything was warm, full, and enough. When they finished, Rachel stood slowly. Before leaving, she walked to the counter. She met Everett's eyes for the first time, fully, directly. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, she said 2 words. "Thank you." She turned, took Eli's hand, and left. Everett stood still long after the door closed. He wasn't waiting for more. That was everything. The next morning, he returned to the diner, opened early again, just in case. They didn't come. Not that day. Not the next. Days passed, then weeks. No sign of Rachel or Eli. At first, Everett worried. Maybe they had moved. Maybe something had happened. Maybe she had chosen to disappear, the way some people do when they finally find enough stability to start over. He waited, quietly. Then one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just the diner's name written neatly on the envelope. Inside was a note, short, handwritten. "You gave us more than food. You gave us back our place in the world. We are safe now. He sleeps in a real bed. I don't know if we'll be back. But I wanted you to know. We were never invisible to you. Thank you. R." Everett folded the letter slowly, pressed it to his chest, and closed his eyes. He didn't cry, but something inside him, something that had been tightly wound for years, finally exhaled. He pinned the letter inside the back room, not on display, just for himself. A reminder that not all investments return in numbers. Some return in silence, in dignity, in the unseen spaces between one soul and another. From that day forward, the diner kept its table by the window open. The DIDN shelf in the back room remained stocked. New names came, new stories unfolded, and Everett watched them all, not as a savior, but as a witness. Because sometimes a warm booth and a silent gesture say more than any grand rescue. Sometimes what a person needs most is simply to be seen. Thank you for spending these moments with us. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight, consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories like this to honor the quiet, powerful moments that often go unseen. And now we'd love to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Scroll down and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.